Viewers, on the case tonight, we put the focus on the Donald Trump-Vladimir Putin meeting. As the world tries to cope with the latest tariff tantrums from the U.S. establishment, Donald Trump is all set to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, this meeting is crucial for a multitude of reasons. Donald Trump is looking to project himself as a peacemaker, is also hoping to bag a Nobel Peace Prize. So the Russia-Ukraine war is expected to be a big part of the discussions. However, one also wonders what happens to India now, as the Trump administration has accused India of funding the Russians by purchasing Russian oil. So what happens now, and what does either side want? Let's break this down for you. First up, here's what the Russian side really wants as far as this crisis is concerned. One, that there should be U.S. recognition of territories annexed by Russia, boosting Russian economy and relief from sanctions for Russia as well. Now, what are we looking at in terms of what the U.S. would want from the Trump's meeting with Putin? Ending the Russia-Ukraine war, a campaign promise as well that has been made by Trump. Trump wants to be seen as the man ending wars, and therefore also a person who is eligible then for the Nobel Peace Prize and would get that recognition is what he's really looking at. Now, remember, the outcome of the meeting could have a significant impact on India as well, which is why the Indian government would be watching this meeting very closely. In fact, the U.S. Treasury Secretary had this to say just ahead of the Trump-Putin meeting. He says that we've put secondary tariff on Indians as well, and he's also gone on to say that tariffs on Indians are for buying Russian oil. He's further added that if things don't go well, tariffs could go up. However, it appears that the Indian government and the economy is largely unfazed by Trump's repeated tantrums. In fact, just earlier today, we were told that global credit rating agency S&P has actually upgraded India's ratings even at a time when Donald Trump is relentlessly targeting the Indian government and its businesses. What have they said? They've said that short and long-term credit rating has been upgraded. The short-term rating has been upgraded from A3 to A2. The long-term rating upgraded from BBB minus to BBB, and S&P has praised India's monetary policy reforms. They've asserted, as far as India is concerned, that it has demonstrated resilience. There's some breaking news coming in as well as far as India's stakes in the Trump-Putin meeting. Top sources are telling Times now that India has gauged the mood after calls with Russia and Ukraine, and more or less understands what will be on the table for negotiations. India is closely monitoring developments to base its policies on the outcome of this meeting and will monitor how Alaskan oil discussions will take place. India will decide on their negotiation strategy based on this Trump-Putin meeting, and India may have already pushed its interest to be tabled in the meeting by Russia tomorrow. Let me take this across to my colleague Rishabh, who's joining us. This is one meeting that government will be looking at very closely, that Indian diplomats will be looking at very closely, because this is one development that could have a huge impact as far as the tariffs and therefore even ties between India and US are concerned.
Well, Madhav, if we talk about this meeting between President Trump and President Putin tomorrow, it is very important for India. It is not just the tariff part of it, but also India's trade negotiation with the United States will depend largely on how things unfold tomorrow in Alaska. We have spoken to multiple officials who are keeping a close watch on this meeting and development, and they have suggested that India spoke to President Zelensky as well as President Putin in last 1 week, and India has already gauged what would be broader sense of discussion that Russia is going to put forward. Okay. India also has spoken to various stakeholders in the United States as well, if not at Prime Minister's level, at a lower level, that how US perceives this meeting.
All right. Depending Rishabh, thanks so much for joining us. Hectic parleys that have been going on as far as the government is concerned. Rishabh, thanks so much for joining us, and over now to the debate. More on this, joining us is Kanwal Sibal, who's a former Foreign Secretary. Also with us is Dr. Jeffrey Gunter, former US envoy. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Kanwal Sibal, let me start with you. What is your outlook as far as this meeting between Trump and Putin is concerned? Do you think that there's a possibility of us arriving at a deal, particularly from the Indian context, and what really the deal could potentially mean for India?
Well, I see that President Trump is walking back a little bit in terms of what he expects from the meeting. And so is Secretary Rubio, who has said that President Trump wants to take a measure of the man. He wants to have direct conversations with him. And President Trump has also said that this is the first meeting. It will be an exploratory meeting. And he hopes to have very soon thereafter a second meeting where more substantive things will be discussed. But the second meeting will depend on how the first meeting goes. In other words, no important breakthroughs could be reasonably expected from the meeting in Alaska. As an outsider and not knowing what has been the tenor of the conversations between Steve Witkoff and President Putin. After all, Putin is a very serious politician, and Russians are very, very able diplomats. They won't walk into this kind of a meeting unless they knew what the consequences of that would be in terms of their fundamental position on Ukraine, which means no Ukraine membership, no membership of NATO for Ukraine, and a limit to the size of its armed forces.
Right.
Now on that, I don't think Trump can. On NATO, yes, he can. He has already said publicly that he doesn't visualize Ukraine being part of NATO. But on some other issues, I don't think Trump can commit himself. I mean, the territorial issues. And he himself said that we will not discuss the territorial issue, although he has been saying all along till yesterday that territorial issues will be discussed. They'll be give and take, and both sides may not be very happy. Vice President Vance also said that. So there's a lot of murkiness in the whole affair. Absolutely. Now I see that the Russians are taking their defense minister and the foreign minister, which means that the conversations will go beyond Ukraine, because there's whole issue of START 2, renewal of the START 2 treaty. That's very, 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 very important. And then some engagement in terms of economic cooperation, etc., etc. So the jury is out. I'm not too sure what will be the result, but I doubt if it will.
A lot of issues on the table over here, particularly when it comes to Russia. As far as the implications for India, I'm just going to come back to you in a short while, Mr. Sibal. But let me get in Dr. Jeffrey Gunter. Jeffrey Gunter, the fact is that you don't have Ukraine at the table in Alaska. Is it possible at all to arrive at a solution? We've seen how meetings in the past have, completely blown up, particularly that one famous interaction of President Trump with Vladimir Zelensky in the White House. And we all know what happened following that. Is there a possibility, because there's so much that needs to be resolved, Ukraine not at the table? Are we being too optimistic when we're looking at or expecting a result from tomorrow night's meeting?
Well, first of all, I'd like to compliment your esteemed guest. As a former U.S. ambassador myself, I thought his analysis was really quite astute, and it was a very good depiction of what's going on. Absolutely. Expectations ahead of all of these bilateral meetings are always minimized, diminished, and that aids in the diplomatic process. So there's no doubt, there's no wonder that you see, great Secretary Rubio, kind of watering things down a little bit right before the summit. That's normal diplomacy. But I have to say, though, if you look at the success, the track record of President Trump, it's been breathtaking as him being the peacetime president. Do not underestimate what he accomplished in Armenia and Azerbaijan. That was a decades-long conflict. Don't diminish what he did with the Abraham Accords with 4 neighboring Arab nations. It's saving lives. And I think President Trump is establishing himself as a peacetime president with an excellent track record. And I think the implication is going to be positive for all countries that are in deep conflict. And I include India and Pakistan as that as well. So I'm quite positive, not being part of the inside discussions with the Trump administration, though I am close to the president. I have no understanding of what's going on behind closed doors. But I can tell you that his goal is the peacetime president. And let's put an end to the killing and the murder of individuals on both sides of the conflict. And let's face it, the Zelensky meeting to the White House was disrespectful on Zelensky's part. That was a miscue. The world community saw that, and both our great Vice President J.D. Vance and President Trump stood up against it, pushed back. And absolutely, you can make a peace deal when it's one-on-one, put 2 guys in a room. That's That's the brilliance of President Trump. That's the brilliance of Steve Witkoff, who in April of 2025 laid the foundation for this meeting. So I've always been optimistic on your shows, and I think good things are to come with President Trump based on his great track record.
Well, I'll just tell you who's not being very optimistic right now, Dr. Gunter. The person who's not been optimistic today is the Treasury Secretary. And before I come across to you, I want Kanwal Sibal to come in on this. You know, the repeated linking of what's happening to India as far as the US tariffs are concerned. First, there was 25%, then an additional 25% with the rider on what will be the outcome of the war. And now again, you have the Treasury Secretary, Howard Besson, coming out to say that there could be more tariffs if these talks are not successful, essentially putting more pressure on India to nudge Russia into ending the war. Is that how we should look at it? Is this just a threat, or is this something that can actually happen on ground?
Look, do you think, or do the Americans think that Modi can go to Putin and say, look, I am being subject to great US pressure and I'm going to be slapped with a lot of secondary sanctions. So please, for my sake, make peace in Ukraine. Come on. This is childish. We have nothing to do with the dynamics of this conflict and with the resolution of this conflict, apart from repeatedly saying that we want diplomacy and negotiations to begin and end put to the conflict. And Prime Minister has been repeatedly saying it's not an era of war. He's spoken to Putin about this. He went and visited Kyiv. He met Zelensky. He's been in touch with Zelensky since then. Even other day he's spoken to Putin and he's spoken to Zelensky. So we are trying, as India, as a leader of the global south with the interests of the larger international community in mind, pushing for an end to this conflict, because this doesn't help us and help others. Now, with regard to the sanctions, okay, he has imposed sanctions, 25% tariff on us because he was not getting the kind of trade deal he wanted. But what is the rationale for imposing an additional 25% tariffs on us as a penalty because we are buying Russian oil, when the Americans themselves have been telling us all this while encouraging us, as we have said formally in Parliament, to buy Russian oil, so that these 5 million barrels that might go out of the market will create a huge rise in spike in prices of oil globally, which would affect the American consumer. Number two, Europe is buying actually more LNG, oil and refined petroleum products than India is. I saw the statistics and I put them on X myself. Since 2022, they have bought $214 billion of these products from Russia, and their imports of LNG from Russia since 2022 actually have gone up year after year. China buys far more oil from Russia than we do. There are pipelines dedicated to this, but he's given a 90 days reprieve to China, but he slapped this 25%, and as you say, Scott Bessent is now saying there could be more. This is blackmail. This is blackmail, and they don't understand the damage this is causing to India-US relations in the long run. Maybe we can come back and find some biomedia and resolve our differences, but the erosion of trust is going to last a long time.
Jeffrey Gunter, your response to that, the erosion of trust is going to last a long time. You don't expect India to put pressure on Putin and tell him to, end the war because of the tariffs. I think that's the crux of the problem here.
I would push back on that last comment. India and America are not only great allies, but we have shared common values. So to talk about we're having long-term damage between the relationship between America and India is, how can you have a long-term relationship with China? How can you have a long-term relationship with South Africa? How can you have a long-term relationship with individuals who do not respect human rights the way America and India have? So I believe that this is just a blip. This is just negotiations. I believe, and I've said this before on your show, that Modi and President Trump in the next 3 years will rejoice over the great relationship that we have with India. And don't forget, this war, just like it's not India's war, is not America's war. This war was started by terrible foreign policy by Joe Biden, just like the other wars that we saw across the country, whether it's on October 7th or elsewhere. Joe Biden, his weakness, His lack of strength, his lack of fortitude is what invited this conflict. And it would never have happened if President Trump was president. Case in fact, not a single U.S. service person died in the last 18 months of the Trump presidency. So I believe still that India and America will be great allies, formed together by our strong convictions and values of freedom and democracy. And what we are just watching is sausage being made. And we know that sausage sometimes tastes quite good, but it's no fun to watch them make it. And that's what's going on between India and America. And stay tuned. We will continue to have a great relationship. But there's frank discussions between close friends and partners. And that's what our great Secretary of Treasury is talking about. And listen, no war in Ukraine is good for all countries. Right. There's a contagion of peace going on, and Trump is the peacetime president. He will and does deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for his great accomplishments. And
there we go again.
Someday in the near future, India and America will be just as close as ever.
Okay. Mr. Sibal, I want you to come in on this whole narrative surrounding the Peace Prize. Is one of the major irritants now how the conflict between India and Pakistan ended. The Prime Minister has been very categorical. He's not named President Trump, but he said that there was no amount of influence. It was Pakistan's DJO who called that DJO, and when they realized that their bases were completely damaged, that this has happened. We've seen how President Trump has repeated about 29 times that he personally ended the war. The two countries were brink of nuclear war, something that again India denies, saying that there's no question of any nukes being involved in this. Until that issue, and even Pakistan, of course, had denied that. Until this issue is resolved, do we see any forward movement, even on the tariff issue?
Well, how can this issue be resolved? I mean, you want us to lie after we've stated in Parliament what you just said? So we can't walk back on it. And it's the truth, because if government was misleading the Parliament, it's a grave political mistake. So I don't think that simply to please President Putin, President Trump, that we are going to actually endorse what he said. Look, as it is, the government has come under such great pressure in Parliament because the impression has been created that we buckled under U.S. pressure, because President Trump, for whatever reason, announced himself that he had not only was instrumental in the ceasefire, but that he used a trade weapon to pressure India. And Pakistan, of course, but to pressure India. Now, if we were to actually give him credit for this, we are also accepting that we yielded to that pressure and creating big problems for India domestically as well as externally. We would be then giving the impression that our entire foreign policy can be controlled or handled by an external power in the way that external power desires things to be. It was not possible for us to play the kind of game that President Trump is playing and what the Pakistanis are playing. And the other thing that actually I find rather amusing is that President Trump has been elected the second time. He still remains popular. He's very sure that he's doing great things for America. Why does he want an endorsement of the Nobel Prize to be able to raise his stature? His stature is already there as the President of the United States. Why does he need it? And the Nobel Peace Prize has gone to all kinds of people who were undeserving.
Absolutely. I think, Dr. Gunter, that's a fair question because, leave aside the validation required from the Nobel Peace Prize, so on and so forth. That's a very valid argument in itself. But the point is this. The point is when you're dealing with a country, there will be a certain amount of domestic pressure that the government will have to face over here. And there are questions being asked in our parliament to the government about whether these means that the government capitulated to pressure coming in from the United States, so on and so forth. So, and with the government having taken a position, surely you can't expect the Indian government to backpedal on that publicly now.
I don't expect them to backpedal, but that has nothing to do with the frank reality that President Trump is doing a phenomenal job internationally, and he has the ability to have his voice be heard, not only domestically, but also internationally. Look he's building a strong relationship with Pakistan. We all can see that, okay? And all of this is guided in one direction, which is peace in the region, save the lives of our young men and women and, innocent hostages and victims of terror. And so far, there's been no president that I've seen that has been more successful in bringing peace to the world, not only in America, with no loss of life in 18 months, but whether it's in Israel, Morocco, Sudan, United Arab Emirates, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and he was influential. He was influential in your conflict. I understand the origins of it. I understand the length of it. But let's face it, it helps when you have a broker there who has a strong relationship with both sides, and he's establishing himself as the peacetime president, and India will be a beneficiary, America will be the beneficiary, Pakistan will be the beneficiary, Russia will be the beneficiary, and especially Ukraine will be the beneficiary when President Trump brings peace to these regions.
All right. Surely, I mean, definitely no one's denying the fact that the senior officials in the Trump administration, the vice president, the secretary of state were in touch with top officials here in India. But did Trump intervene is a big question. At the moment, certainly the answer coming from the government of India is no. And how can we resolve all of that, as well as the separate other issues which are being linked by the U.S. to the war ending between Russia and Ukraine? All of that is something that we'll be watching out for tomorrow night when that meeting between Putin and Trump takes place. Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen, this evening.
The News Hour at 10 will be right back after the break.
The biggest news break of the day. Exclusive that set the primetime agenda. Bringing you stories that matter. News breaks that shake up the system. Join us for the biggest revelation on blue